My dear viewers, have you ever thought about how we view history? More specifically, about the meta-narratives about the direction of history and how we view history as unfolding. Because there are quite a lot of views that you can have on history. And I intend to describe some of these views in this video. Starting with progressive history, that is to say the idea that history is progressing towards a goal or for greater improvement. This view has its background in the fact that to a certain degree progress has always existed in certain forms in history. We have, for example, technological progress and improvements to life that have happened in history due to advancements in knowledge and in the development of new ideas. You also have the fact that this view of history began or had one of its strongest foundations in the Western world, where it probably began in Christianity and its telos, its end view of us humans working towards the end of days where there will be a salvation, where Christ will come forth and save everyone at the end of days. And this optimistic view of the world and history was added upon by later Enlightenment thinkers during the Enlightenment, and then also by even later progressive views of history, such as the ones that developed through Hegel and later Marx, in that they began to theorize about a better end point of history, a progress of history towards better and better systems that would eventually lead to an end point of ultimate betterment, of ultimate progress. The idea of historical progress here, despite its many variations and its many theories that have been used to justify it or to explain it, is anchored in a worldview or structure of thought which sees a cumulative advancement towards an all-encompassing encounter with a universal good or universal state of progress and its realization through the progress of history. History has with this view a clear direction of advancement. This view of history is still present among a lot of historians, but a lot less than it was in the past, before the 1960s and the rise of postmodernism, which criticized a lot of these progressive views on history. Despite many of these postmodernists actually having progressive views on politics, which is an entirely different matter. And progressiveness in politics should not be confused for being the same thing as having a progressive view of history, as they are different concepts, even if they sometimes are related. But going back to the views of history as being progressive, it is still a view that is quite common among people. For example, you have a pop variant of progressive history seen in the works of Fukuyama and his ideas about the end of history and the idea that everything will go towards liberal democracy as the end point of history. Now you also have the opposite of progressive history, and that is the view of regressive history, which is that more or less humanity is doomed and history is going to go downwards. It's going to become worse and worse the longer humanity goes through history. Historically, this worldview, this view of history, has been quite common among certain Christian groups and certain Islamic groups. Though I would argue that the main view of history in the Islamicate world has been cyclical history, which I will go through later in this video. And what I'm discussing here is more with regard to certain Islamic thinkers within the Salafi, Ibadi and Maturidi traditions of Islam that had this view, as well as those within Christian traditions that have had this view as well, in opposition to the progressive view of history within Christianity that has also existed in parallel. They have viewed history as being kind of a process where people are getting away from the true source of the divine inspiration that occurred in the past, from the divine, from the connection to God. Now, this view was more common in the past in Christianity. In Islam, this view still exists among certain traditions, but mostly it is very uncommon to see it among Christian thinkers today, Though theologians such as Jacques Ellul have still promoted this view, so it is not entirely gone. Interestingly enough, Jacques Ellul was very critical of technology and how it negatively impacted society, and that was one of the main parts of his criticism, how technology is slowly making society and our relationship to the divine worse, and how it threatens our freedoms. Actually, on the topic of technology, being critical of technology is quite common among those that have a regressive view on history, with environmentalists and anthropic historians that like to emphasize the threatening nature of technology and the risk of collapse and natural chaos that stems from our lack of control over our own development. For example, you have Chellis, Glendinning, an environmental activist who is very critical about the use of technology and how our technological developments threaten the natural order of the world. Though it is not just theologians and environmental activists that have had this view of history as being regressive, but also proper historians. Historians such as Leo Marx, not to be confused with the progressive historian and philosopher Karl Marx. Leo Marx has this view that technology destroys previous culture and is an eroding element. History, in the view of Leo Marx, is a process of technology coming and destroying what was before. And you will see this in a lot of regressive history, in that it is very usually conservative leaning, or it wants to preserve something, and they see history as being the process of destruction of what they want to preserve or what they want to remain. And as history is full of changes, chaos and destruction of things from the past, it is not that weird that this view develops if you have something that you treasure a lot and see as the ultimate good or the ultimate thing to preserve, that you will then view history and the passing of time as a threat to it, and thus see history as being regressive. For example, if you want to preserve culture, to preserve the environment, or to preserve something else, and you see all the factors working against the preservation of these things, then history will seem as a threatening force. As history is just time letting these factors grind these things down, these things you treasure, into nothingness. And thus your view of history will be that it is regressive. Now, both progressive and regressive history is history where the state of mankind or the state of something that is studied in history is moving in a direction that is very clear. But there are other types of history where there isn't this kind of movement, at least not in a clear direction. For example, you have cyclical history, where you see repeating cycles of history repeating itself as the main view of history. And in certain regards this is true after all. History does have repeating elements, and that is why we can see patterns in history and see things occurring and reoccurring in history. And why we at times are actually capable of making predictions based upon previous patterns of repeatable occurrences. And cyclical occurrences occur a lot in nature. For example, notice the seasons, notice various cycles of life and death that occur in nature, with animals feeding on plants, animals dying and decomposing and becoming sustenance for plants, which are in turn once again eaten by new animals that die and thus decompose and become sustenance for new plants, and so on and so forth. So there exist elements in both history and in nature which predisposes people to view history as being cyclical. And the earliest examples we have of clear cyclical views of history is in the repeating historical cycles of history as described by the ancient Greek philosophers of Plato and the historian Polybius, where they speak about cycles of political entities, of, for example, democracies turning corrupt and into mob rule, that in turn turns into authoritarian dictatorships, that in turn turn into monarchies, that in turn gets revolted against, and thus we are back at democracy again, and the cycle continues. And in the Islamic world, despite having largely similar worldviews to Christianity, actually adopted mostly a cyclical view of history through thinkers such as Ibn Khaldun and his concept of al-Asabiyya, which was a concept about the cyclical nature of tribal unity and how success brings complacency and issues of unity, which in turn makes you vulnerable to be replaced by less successful people around you that do have greater unity. People unite to create great empires, but these empires become decadent, and people outside of these empires take advantage of this decadence and have stronger unity and thus conquer these empires, and the cycle continues like this. And in modern times we have the cyclical views of civilizations by people such as Spengler, and we have now the modern views of people such as Turchin and his cliodynamics, and various views of generational history, which is based upon a cyclical view of history as being a result of repeating patterns. Cyclical history is similar to progressive and regressive history in that it is a type of predictive history, in that it tries to predict where history is going. It has a pattern of history, but it does not have a direction of history, in the sense of the greatest overview, as the direction of history is totally dependent upon where in the points of these patterns, in these cycles, you are. If you're going to go in one direction or if you're going to go into another direction. As these recurring patterns are the main view of history in cyclical history. And more or less you will get back to square one again. In this sense, cyclical history is actually quite similar to the next view of history, and that is linear or static history, where history is seen as unchanging more or less. History does not change, and what we are seeing are just iterations of the same underlying thing in various versions, but ultimately human nature and human experience through history will not change greatly, as the great factors that underline human history, such as human nature and the greater realities of the world, makes it so that history will not change. It will just be a process that just moves on a timescale, where these factors, even if they play out somewhat differently due to different technology, still are essentially the same thing. Neither progress or regress happens, it's just a process of a constant human nature interacting with his environment, both of which are, in many regards, very unchanging in this view of history, for both good and ill. The view of this history is kind of the view of a very deterministic process, without any true value or input or even direction that could be valued in one way or the other, as being progressive or regressive. History simply is a process in which we humans are caught in it. And sure, there are both progressive and regressive historians and cyclical historians that would argue that one state or the other is preferable to another state in history. But linear historians would more or less just argue that history is just something that happens. It's not preferable or more preferable, it's just the process. A process we might not even be able to change or influence at all. Historians associated with linear static history tend to view history with very long time frames and include factors that often go beyond singular local cultures and personal influences, such as taking into account geography, the availability of resources, human non-culture bound psychology, if such a thing is theorized to exist, the effects of diseases upon history, and other greater factors that are beyond normal human control in their considerations of history, with a longer view on history. An example of this sort of history would be Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel, which describes the processes that made Europe ascend due to factors such as the geography and the availability of resources in Europe, together with the effects of diseases upon the history of European ascent for a long view of history. You also have McNeill and McNeill's The Human Web, which describes how greater internationalization and contact nets develop through natural deterministic processes. What separates more positive static linear history from being, for example, progressive history, is that static linear history usually has a focus upon factors and history being something that is acted upon humankind, rather than as history being the result of humankind doing acts, like in progressive history. For example, if we were to use the classical example of the class struggle found in Marxism, with the view of history just being a result of class struggle, and progress being a result of this class struggle, which also is greater than the singular individual in history, in classical Marxist views, then it would differ from linear static history in the way that it's still about a social construction. It's still something that humans do that create history. Human behavior change and humans act differently due to various contextual factors that are changing due to the factors of the class struggle, which is a human product. An act of human action which changes history, which makes history progress to change, rather than a view of static linear history, where humans are only responding to actions outside of them in a greater context and just going along the road that is already set for them, due to these factors that are beyond the control of humanity, and thus more or less beyond our actions and judgments too. Now I have been talking about long views of history and very broad, large-scale views of history, and very deterministic sorts of history where history remains the same, or all types of history can be seen as the same type of history going back to greater factors of history, leaving very little room for specific history to happen, or for exceptions to occur, for various parts of history to be unique, as something separate from other types of history. Which leads into the view of historicism, which is the view of viewing history or parts of history as islands of history. Viewing history as disconnected dots here and there, happenings in isolated contexts which describe them and explains them. Happenings, social and cultural practices are the result of specific histories behind them, where you have to take specific factors into the context of understanding these things. You see this in the case of the early German historian Leopold Ranke and later national history, where the national history is a unique context, where the nation serves as a context for the national history, as something unique for that nation. Though it must not necessarily always be national history, it can be any sort of history or any sort of context or era that is viewed as having a very specific context around it, a very specific epoch or area of history that needs its own considerations that are unique to it. History in this view is less about creating predictions based upon the past and more about understanding the past, understanding how it happened, and understanding humanity in its various forms that have existed throughout history. Understanding yourself and understanding how different the world could be by looking at how people lived in the past that was radically different from your situation. Or maybe not that different. After all, understanding how you do not differ that much is also an important aspect of understanding. And just because you have a historic view of history does not mean that you can't appreciate the history of other contexts than your own. In fact, many of the earliest German scholars of the Orient, of the Middle East, were inspired by Leopold von Ranke's views when they were studying the history of the Middle East. And in many regards they were far more balanced in viewing the Middle East than the scholars found in France or in the Anglo-Saxon countries, who mostly followed progressive views of history and often had views about civilizational developments, rather than viewing the objects of study as something unique and as a result of a unique context. Now, with this said about the historist view of history, you do have a problem in that it is harder to make generalizations based upon history and make predictions based upon history, as everything is so confined to contexts that are specific to these eras or areas of study in your view of history as being specific to a particular part of history. But it should not be forgotten that humans do have a lot of things in common that are reoccurring in history, and you sometimes need to have another view of history than the historicist view in order to explain certain common patterns and certain similarities that you do see, and to make predictions based upon these patterns, and to make theories regarding these patterns that are not just isolated occurrences in specific isolated contexts, but a part of greater historical trends, where you can go from the specific, very local, in for example micro history as seen with the history by Carlo Ginzburg, into greater patterns of history, with smaller history for greater contexts, without creating an overarching deterministic overview of the specifics in every case. Following historist views of specific historical contexts, we have evolutionary history, or Darwinist history, where objects, ideas, cultural phenomena, and whatever you study in history do not have a specific direction to which history flows, but rather history has branches, or rather the objects within history have branches. And history here is just a description of an evolutionary process, where certain objects or ideas die out, and or certain objects flourish and become other ideas and change into other ideas in other contexts. This type of history is not about progress, but patterns of survival, a type of Darwinism, or cultural Darwinism rather, applied to ideas and cultural phenomena in history. You see this type of history in mimetic history, in the study of memes, as in ideas that survive and spread depending upon their cultural niche and the context around them, that determine if these ideas will spread or be hindered from spreading, and or if they change and become more adapted to spreading, and or if the environment around these memes change in such a way that they do not spread, or that they spread more. That is mimetic history, which first came from Richard Dawkins and his book The Selfish Gene, where he mentioned the idea about memes as units of cultural replication that are exposed to similar processes of evolution like genes are. And this idea, or rather this meme that Richard Dawkins created, later got adopted by certain later historians that then used it in their history descriptions of describing certain phenomena. History here, and specifically culture, is the result of a process of evolution that is documented and described by an historian. Like how a biologist would describe the natural evolution of certain species. Now, the mixing of biology and history does have a darker side in the past, far before the time of Richard Dawkins, when it was about race and biological Darwinism applied to people. But that is not the same thing as the thing I'm describing here, where it is about culture rather than biology, and the social Darwinism of the early 20th and 19th centuries. But in any case, Darwinistic history views history as being more like a branching tree with various directions and with various different developments depending upon different niches and different study objects having different functions in different niches. But it is still based upon the fundamental grand narrative of the survival, or lack thereof, of ideas and objects in history. Something that makes it similar to deterministic linear history in that they propose certain ideas that determine history on a grand scale. But evolutionary history allows a broader difference between very specific types of histories due to the contexts being different in various places in a way that linear history does not, as the linear factors there remain unchanging rather than the changeable niches and changeability of the object studied in evolutionary history. The idea of evolution applied to history is fundamentally based upon the idea of of history changing and not being static, of adaptation taking place, of not being stuck in one system always. So despite being historical grand narrative views of history, they are quite different. And on the subject of narratives, that is at the core of the next view of history I'm going to discuss. And that is postmodernism, which either describes a lack of a narrative direction in history or is skeptical of a narrative direction in history. You see this in Michel Foucault, who claimed that grand narratives are just a result of discourses, which in turn are the result of power relationships. Thus, objective fact and knowledge does not exist, separate from power, and any direction in history is just a result of a power relationship being played out in a discourse. You also see the same kind of criticism from Bouchard in his claims about science just being a meta-narrative and not being a true reflection of the real, and so on and so forth. Postmodernism and all of the views that are coming from postmodernist thought are not the same thing. We have several very different traditions within postmodernism, and thus different traditions regarding the view of history in them. But generally, very broadly, there is a lack of a meta-narrative to these sorts of history. As in, they do not have an overarching view of human history, as it is not possible to objectively create one. And if you do create one as a postmodernist, it is not part of an objective history, but rather a part of discourse, or your own view of history as claimed to be objective or claimed to be the truth in a discourse. And speaking about a direction in history, such as progress, regress, cycles, a linear static view of history, historicism as cases being very specific to one certain specific history, or viewing history as a result of evolutionary processes, are all narratives. In postmodernist thought, history is just a narrative that you describe, and or it is so complex and so chaotic that history cannot be fully described in a sufficient way, leaving any description as a subjective narrative. And the most radical postmodernist positions even reject any historical truth or objective fact claim in any case, as it is all narrative. And consequently, history is just competing narratives. And though I do agree that there are elements of narrative to history, and you also have the fact that history is very complex, I reject usually the idea that you cannot get closer to a truth, or that every truth statement is the same when it comes to history, as certain traditions within postmodernism would claim. And in this, even certain traditions within postmodernism would agree with me as well. If we were to describe history in the postmodernist sense in a somewhat reductive manner, it would be as a total mess of competing ideas and claims about history and views of history, with no real discernible direction of history, which is also a very meta way of viewing the entire discussion about the views that exist regarding history and its direction, many of which I have gone through here, and many of which I have not mentioned because they are pretty obscure, and I could have gone into a lot more detail in a lot of these overviews about the views. But they are pretty much competing views about how you view history. Though with that said, it does not mean that you can't actually combine some of these views together and form various hybrid views of history as well. You could, for example, imagine cyclical history, but history that also is progressive somewhat, even if the cycles are momentarily step-backs in the road towards progress, for example, as a view of history. And the truth is that many people do not have just one singular view of history and its direction or lack thereof, but often combine and have different views of history for different cases of history, and or combine these views into various hybrid views when they make history. I hope you liked this video of mine discussing the views of history and its direction. And please post comments and questions in the comment section, as I love discussing history with you, my viewers. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.